Welcome to Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast where innovation isn't just an ideal, it's a way of life. I'm your host and creator of the Innovate, Disrupt, or Die newsletter, Danny Nathan. Hello, folks. Welcome back to another episode of Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast. This week's guest is Celia Wanderley. Celia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to a good chat. Celia, we'll start with the easy question here. Tell me a bit about yourself, your background, and what interests you or excites you about the world of innovation.
Yeah, so an interesting thing about myself is that I'm originally from Brazil. My education background is computer science, and I have been operating at the intersection of business and technology for over 25 years, closer to 30 now, which is almost scary to say.
Every year it gets a little harder to share how long it's been,
Right.
doesn't it? I've been right there.
And as to maybe what interests me in the world of innovation, I think I've always been very much attracted to the idea of solving problems, right? And maybe not solving problems just with the old tools or the old ideas that we had. Um, of course, a lot of my tool set is in the world of has been in the world of technology. So being able to operate at that intersection where I can use those tools that I come with me, either from experience or what I'm seeing coming up in R&D in the academic world as well, and connecting the dots, finding the right places as to where we can apply those innovations to solve real world problems. So I think, more and more we talk about the focus on the humans, right? So technology and augmentation as an enabler of human capability. And I'm a big believer in that type of thinking. So I think it is very much, I see innovation as a way to really tackle that one challenge, which is how do we use our combined knowledge, experience, tools, technology included, to make lives of humans better, more exciting. And some of the problems that we have historically had to tackle, but that are even now larger, things like, sustainability, climate change, health, and then so many others. How do we use what we learn and our collective wisdom to make those problems easier to tackle?
Gotcha. So you said that your educational background was in computer science. Is that right?
Right. Yes.
How did you end up making, maybe it was a move, maybe it wasn't. How did you end up sort of migrating from computer science into innovation as opposed to, I don't know, becoming a software engineer or something like that? Or did you focus on software engineering for a while and then sort of grew into the innovation space?
I'd say that I still do. So I see those things as very much intertwined. So what I would say where a little bit of a migration happened, or maybe a change of my original thinking was that I was gonna, as I went into graduate school, was that I'm gonna stay in academia, and I've always had a passion for teaching
Mm-hmm.
and mentoring. But then, I quickly understood that I needed to be closer to the application of of maybe research and of technology than just being in research. So the applied side was very, very important to me, and that's so the shift to industry happened soon after I discovered that about myself. The innovation that I use and that I help drive with the clients that I work with is very much tied to software in the last few years. Very much tied to artificial intelligence, be it the traditional machine learning, the predictive side, or the generative side, and now more into the agentic side. So I don't see those things as separate. I would say that it is what I bring as let's say as my own type of specialized experience and expertise, but with a lens of how to drive and how to help others to drive it in my own teams, but also to help clients drive in their own organizations and in their teams, drive innovation with the use of this of the technologies and tool sets that that software engineering and AI engineering gives me.
Interesting. Celia, your your answer brings up another question for me. I've spoken to a few folks that have talked at length about sort of the balance between the academic and the industry side of innovation. I find it interesting that you talk about, thinking that you were going to stay on the academic side and then eventually feeling the itch to kind of jump ship and move over. How do you see the relationship between academia and industry, and do you think there's a hard and fast line between research and discovery comes out of academia and implementation comes out of the industry side, or is there an opportunity to blur the lines more?
I love that you asked that question because I'm a big believer in the partnerships, right? So
Hmm.
not just a believer in saying I'm a believer, but in actually driving that
Good.
in any opportunity that I have. Uh, so and I'd say maybe because of the space that I've been in for the last few years, the AI space, you have to be closely aligned even with the talent pipeline coming out of universities because in
Hmm.
and I honestly did not think that I don't know that 20 years ago I thought okay this is how things are going to go because there was the time horizon between like say a breakthrough or something coming up in research and it being applied in industry. It used to be there used to be a bit of a lag, right?
Yeah.
And yet like, there's something that literally came up 2 weeks ago, and like this morning I'm talking to my team about how we're going to apply it to a problem we already have. We're already seeing that problem in the industry. So the acceptance for that shorter, time horizon between something being, let's say, published and you starting to use it, I think that in this space, just because of the sheer pace of how the technology is
Yes.
evolving, is quite different. But you have to be more intentional. So you have to find ways to have those collaborations with academia, be it with the professors that specialize in certain fields, be it with as a talent pipeline for graduate students or or undergraduate students for work integrated learning opportunities, so that you have a team that is almost that good hybrid, a team that understands how industry operates, the regulatory compliance
Hmm.
requirements, right? The need for deterministic outputs of what we're building, but a team that is a bit more accepting of let's also look at what's coming up and how we could shape it in a way that still allows us to meet all of these requirements and constraints of industry, but that gives us an edge,
Hmm.
both short term but also long term.
Interesting. So you mentioned keeping up with professors and courses and sort of the programs in the academic institutions that you think are, I presume, producing interesting findings, research, et cetera. How do you go about keeping up with whatever's the latest? I mean, you just mentioned, here's a paper that was published 2 weeks ago and we're talking about implementing it now. Do you spend a lot of time scanning through, academic journals and looking for the latest and greatest, or do you have, I don't know, a news feed or something that you've created for yourself? Like, I'm curious how you go about finding the right things to take advantage of.
Yeah, the answer is and
Of course.
crazy because there's so many sources, right? I think information overload is definitely a
Well,
thing.
and that's part of the reason that I'm asking is because there's so much out there. I mean, finding the right stuff at the right time that's interesting has got to be time consuming.
And finding what to trust, right? Because
Yeah.
honestly, I like to say to my friends that I'm so skeptical now of everything we consume that I have to go and double check 3 times different sources to see if I'm gonna believe it in the in a world where we have deep fakes and
Yeah.
a lot of those things coming up. So I'd say it is a collective. It is like signing subscriptions to maybe more of the what industry would consider like uh, the long-standing sources of how we how we will learn about innovation and technology, but also other things that following different people who publish things that are interested. So, how do you leverage what other people are doing in your network to also stay up to date?
Uh,
And I think it's kind of like a good way to put it. The other thing too is in my own teams. And so the same way that I think as you try to drive this behavior of curiosity, of learning, and your teams also start to follow, to mirror that behavior, and they are doing the same. So there's maybe your external collaborators and the people you follow that are doing that research on their own, and and things will come to you. But also as a team, how do we help one another and make 1 plus 1 equals 3 as far
mhm,
as collective knowledge and learning, and being able to share with one another, creating the opportunities for the team to share those findings, those learnings, so
sure.
that again you almost encourage that good cycle or a good flywheel of how that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Celia, you mentioned partnerships a moment ago and sort of the importance of, or your interest in cultivating real partnerships, not just in name, but in action. Does that then sort of cross over into how you work with academic institutions and the people that are doing the research? Or how do you go about cultivating those partnerships?
It does, yeah, and there are some, there are some very structured ways on how to do that, right? So I think, for example, even some of the work integrated learning type of partnerships in which let's say, I may share with specific professors the types of things that we are interested in driving as far as
Hmm.
let's IP development, and again, this is applied. Yeah, so it's not necessarily, we're not, I think the breakthroughs in research are still primarily happening. Well, I'd say not just academia, but big technology companies investing in
Yeah.
millions of dollars, right? In those, in those endeavors. But being able to maybe share a little bit more of, okay, this is the area where we're really trying to drive application of the latest and greatest. And this is the type of skills and talent that we would be interested in supplementing our team with, so that we can drive that type of applied industry solution.
Hmm.
And then again, creating the mechanisms that allow you for onboarding that type of talent in your team, be it, part-time, be it for a, a specific term or 2 terms or whatever. I think things change as far as what that window of time is, and the time in in someone's let's say academic career where they will be interested in coming and joining the team. And again, using that as a talent pipeline as well for the team to continue to remain fresh.
Hmm. Um, so yeah, I would imagine that as you're discovering, newly released papers and new ideas, particularly those that are coming out of a more academic source, that I don't know, I'm envisioning a student that's, 3 years out of 4 through their schooling or something, who you might want to bring on board to help with a project. How do you structure that? I mean, do you bring them on and they get credit? Do they become a part-time employee and, they actually get paid by the organization as well? Or how does that balance happen so that they have an opportunity to excel and to help deploy the thing that they've come up with without entirely disrupting their schooling?
Mhm. Yeah, you would see, I think the world of education is shifting immensely. I think, especially as we have seen, I think it was already happening, like the trajectory had started. But as we see the impact of generative AI in education, you're seeing
Hmm.
even more of that. So I would say a lot of the institutions that I have partnered with in my past and present, they've already realized that those work integrated learning experiences are essential to someone's. Doesn't matter that you're gonna be there for 8 years if you're not in that constant interaction, like applied setting. By the time you leave, you're gonna be you could potentially be at a disadvantage because you
Hmm.
do know. I'll give you an example, even in technology, right? So you may be learning the latest and greatest algorithms and and techniques. But in many cases, you may still not be applying that in the commercial platforms, like the big
Right.
hyperscalers, the big data platforms, like a Databricks, like a Snowflake. So when we bring, to your more specific questions about how we do it, yes, generally there's a well-structured program at that academic institution that will give those students credits. There will be, either in a subsidized manner or not. There's going to be pay in a certain way. There's even IP agreements, right? Because let's say
Mm,
in our case that if you are creating solutions for clients, in many cases those clients will own those
right.
IPs. So you have to have an agreement that also respects all of those boundaries. But we also need to account there's an investment on industry's part. So we have to make sure that we have good onboarding, almost like boot camp type of programs where people will come in, start to pair the knowledge they already have
Hmm.
with how industry applies it, which in some cases may be, and in our case, especially, a lot of it is like the platforms that we use. So this is the technique and and the how to, but this gets applied in some of these commercial platforms that can scale. That are reliable, that can scale, that have the security necessary for something to reach a production
Right.
stage in a real organization, right?
I'm personally a believer that culture, especially within a workplace organization, is one of the biggest enabling factors for teams that are pursuing innovation. The ability for someone to experiment, to try weird things, to do something that might ultimately fail, but that will have learnings built in along the way. How do you go about establishing and maintaining that kind of culture of innovation so that people feel like they have permission to go out and find a 2-week old research paper and know that they won't get laughed out of the room when they come in and say, "Oh my God, this undergrad kid from some school we've never heard of just published this. Isn't it amazing?" That, they get taken seriously, for example.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I couldn't agree more. Like, I think culture is a big part of driving innovation, right? And I think something you talked about is almost this notion of psychological safety to do innovation. I think really important too. And I know we always talk about, being allowed to fail. Uh, and like you would probably have heard a lot of people say, like, it's being allowed to learn, right? Because
Yes.
there's rarely something that it's it rarely all goes to waste. Even if you're working on something and that the exact idea or the the thought process you had on how that would reach maybe adoption
Hmm.
isn't exactly that linear. But I think in my experience, there's always something that you take away and that you would then go and apply to your next thing, right? Or or you move on to an adjacent idea, or there's building blocks here that then make your next project, even if it's not adjacent, go a little bit faster because of the things you have learned. Or it saves you from an even bigger investment because you know what? Actually, I tried the riskiest part of this overall idea, and I now know that it's more complex than we imagined or that we're not ready. So I think that culture of experimentation, and it's not just the culture, but it's also that framework, that discipline process of experimentation, I think is something that the organization has to have made peace with and said we allow ourselves to operate in this manner,
Hmm.
but we all know that there's a lot more at play. So there's shareholders, there's there's the bottom line, there's regulatory requirements. So I think it is about like you in finding those core values and that those pieces that you're going to embed in your culture, you also have to be realistic and say within this boundaries and these constraints that as an organization we have to abide by, and in order to
Sure.
to continue to move things along. This is how we're going to frame our innovation process and our disciplined framework, and then start to maybe promote not just the values, but also those disciplined processes and frameworks, so that innovation can happen in a more sustainable manner. And a bit of frustration by some of those stakeholders, that I know an innovation leader would come, would announce, big investments, and then things would not pan out as expected. Then it would be that that innovation org would be dismantled, and then you
Yep.
just go back, and a few years down the road, another cycle. So that can be very frustrating. So I would say that as you think about values, you have to think about that psychological safety and the discipline in innovation, but also that the realistic approaches that work in your organization for it to be sustained.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Celia. Especially, I mean, I too have seen the sort of cyclical nature of we want to innovate, and then, oh wait, it's really hard to do. Let's hold off for a little while. If somebody came to you, or if somebody hired you, for example, and said, we want to be innovative, what would you say to them, or how would you encourage them to plan for the work of innovation so that ideally they don't end up in that cycle?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's two things that I'll almost start with what it isn't, right? What to avoid. There's two things that I have noticed. One is there's sometimes an association of innovation and invention, and this idea that to be innovative, we have to be, it's that you are only doing innovation if you're inventing something completely new, and that's not, as we know it, that's not necessarily the case, right? So
Hmm.
you may drive very interesting, sustainable innovation with process changes alone, or it may be using like a product or a service in a way that it wasn't initially envisioned for. I think, interesting example I find is like the GPUs and how they were created for, video processing, and all of a
Right.
sudden a mass breakthrough that they allowed in because of how well suited they were for machine learning, right? And the resurgence of this area, and how that one thing, just a use of something a little differently, allowed us to do. I'd say that's number one. Try to be a bit more practical and about what innovation really is. The second one that I also see is that there's almost sometimes an association of innovation happening in chaos, which is completely further from the truth. And in my experience, it tends to be actually a disciplined process.
Hmm.
We talked about culture and say, okay, how do we drive the right culture so that innovation can actually happen? Then how do we design a process that that works within our own organizational boundaries and our constraints? How do we create a path? How do we envision a path where innovation doesn't die in the lab? And what I mean by that is that we understand how we take it to the next stages. How is it going to be adopted by our teams, by our clients? What are the success criteria that we're going to be measuring? So I think, if I were to just to summarize, if I were to give people maybe not advice, but sharing it from experience where I've seen in so many places, it would be these two things: adopt a more practical approach to innovation, create the right culture, but it is not chaos. It is a disciplined process, right? With outcomes in mind.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you point that out, Celia. I feel like the discipline and the psychological safety that you were talking about sort of have to go hand in hand. It's hard for innovation, I think, not to feel chaotic if people are trying to move beyond sort of the creative boundaries that are put in place by the organization. But if those boundaries are put in place in a manner where people have that psychological safety that we were talking about, then I think that perhaps they are more willing to think about how to stretch the creative boundaries, knowing that they won't be looked down upon for it, or won't be penalized for it, or fired for it, or whatever it is. So I think that's a really interesting take.
Yeah, no, agree.
So we've talked a bit about culture and you've sort of nodded at process, Celia. How do you go about helping clients and to create processes that support and enable innovation within their organizations?
Yeah, in some cases, so I'd say that there's a lot of maybe sharing at first, right? So like what I have seen in that works. So for example, I'd say that in most talking about enterprise companies, the most common model looks a little bit like an innovation lab of sorts,
Hmm.
and that has its own structure. But I've also seen different models where maybe enterprises choose to buy a startup
Yeah.
that is very strong in a certain capability to be able to leapfrog some of the challenges we talked about on, okay, how do we do disciplined innovation, how do we create psychological safety, and sometimes it feels like it's an easier path to just onboard some. But in either case, I think there could be challenges. And part of it is, so let's say even if you buy innovation capability, if you haven't taken care of maybe that culture side, it could be that it never gets integrated. And then
Hmm.
other areas of the organization never benefit from that investment you have made, or do not benefit to the extent they could, by that capability.
Right.
And in the other fashion where you were building this innovation labs types of capabilities, one of the things that I have seen that could be a challenge is again tied to integration. So if you have it is very easy to get seen as to become associated with this ivory tower image because you're
Yeah.
doing your own thing, but nobody really knows what you're doing, and you don't get to demonstrate often. You don't get to have input. So I'd say that paying attention to that integration to the other parts of the org, but also to being open to creating the mechanisms to have this cross-functional diversity. We talk about diversity of thought, but diversity of thought not just in cultures and backgrounds, but even within your organization. So I think those are two things that maybe there's different models, but paying attention to this, to how you embed diversity of thought, show the learners, in a more consistent manner, not just at the end, but also thinking, yeah, this overall thinking that innovation needs to be integrated with the rest of the org.
Celia, I want to come back to the model conversation here in just a moment because I have another question there. But before I do, what ways have you seen that have proven successful in terms of propagating both the thinking and the outcomes across a larger organization? How do you go about doing exactly what you're describing?
I think just s- it's it takes a little bit of change management
Hmm.
because it's not uncommon that the client would come to me and all they're looking for is like, let's say, one specific AI solution, or how do we talk about agentic AI and what's going to be, so that it's almost like there's laser focus on one thing, and then
Right.
as we open up this conversation, there's all these opportunities. But if we don't tackle this underlying capability first, nothing ever moves, right? It is creating enough trust that people will want to hear about that more foundational enablement, so that we can then, in the work that we do together, we're not just gonna do that one thing that may die, may never leave
Right.
proof of concept of pilot, but that we're helping them plant the seeds. Use this, sometimes it's use this one example or use this one initiative to also start to put the seeds, plant the seeds, or start to
Yeah.
build this foundation that then allows you to be successful with everything else. And that everything else may be something that I'm not going to help them with, or my team's
Hmm.
going to help them with, but it may be something else that they do themselves, or that they even invite others, right? So one thing
Yeah,
that
it's the
really,
old teach someone to fish versus handing them a fish moment.
exactly. And there's something that I've seen more prominent, I would say, in this last few months, as agentic AI becomes so top of mind, which is um, because it's such an overwhelming like it's like every an overwhelming discussion. Like every technology you implement, every vendor you work with, they're all bringing in and saying, buy my AI or implement my AI, right?
Yes.
And like now let's or my agentic AI, the new flavor. And so I'm seeing in some cases the innovation capability or those innovation labs in these organizations become even more distracted because they are going to be testing out all of these niche products, but the whole story just doesn't add up. Because it could be that all these niche products will be successful, but how do you make that whole?
Celia, I want to circle back to the model conversation. You've mentioned the idea of innovation labs. You mentioned the idea of sort of buying innovation and onboarding it. Uh, what are some of the other models that you're excited about? I know in our intro call, you mentioned that you spent some time at a venture studio, which is a model that is near and dear to my heart. And then, of course, I'm also curious about whether or not you kind of believe that the innovation lab model can be successful. I feel like there's a lot of people out there that are going, yep, they're standing up another innovation lab. It's going to be there for 18 months and then it'll disappear and whatever. So, how do you kind of take all of those parts and put them together into something of value?
Yeah, I do think it can be successful. But again, if we go back to all of those foundational pieces, right? Culture, process,
Hmm.
adoption, not being like just an ivory tower. And if those things precede uh, this, I say this idea of a distraction, because there's going to be a lot of those coming up. As far as the venture studio model, I think the way in how I was a part of it in the past was very focused on, let's say, startups and startup founders. So
Hmm.
founders would come to us with very interesting ideas. In some case, they would have spent a very long time in a particular industry, so that they would have relationships, the subject matter expertise, and deeply understand the challenges of or a particular challenge in or a particular opportunity in that industry. But they did not have the, let's say, the engineering
Yeah,
training or the engineering resources to go drive product development. And also they did not have, let's say, everything that a company needs to have, like be it HR, finance,
back
marketing,
office.
all of those things, the back office that is unfortunately is really important, and that that can be very distracting to a founder who maybe that's not their love and their expertise. So what we would provide to those founders and was this baseline back office capability, the engineering capability to drive product development, and then allow those founders to really focus on product market fit, go to market, and product development to
Hmm.
accelerate that journey, but also to, in some ways, to have more ideas be successful, because by the time you had all of these things, the I'd say the rate of success was higher than what you would see in other models. So I do think that in a corporate environment, there could be analogous models that could be successful, right? I would say that even what we talked about just a couple minutes ago, which is this idea that enterprises, large enterprises have in many cases bought like a
Hmm.
startup that had like a specific capability and then allowed that to flourish within their environments. So I think it can, these types of models can be successful as well in an enterprise setting, but you have to then go back to what do we need to be successful in an enterprise setting, and a lot of those other constraints, and you have more resource. On one hand, you have these resources that you may not have to be going externally, to fight for,
Right.
right? It was so hard, and so such a lot of time is spent in, let's say, fundraising and all of those things. So you have things that are beneficial as being a part of an enterprise, a larger corporate, but there's a lot of things that could hold you back as well. So it's like finding that good balance of the what you what you bring as strengths, but but also the outcomes that you can drive.
Celia, if an organization were to start with something like an innovation lab, do you think there's an opportunity then in success for that to grow into something analogous to a corporate venture studio where over time those capabilities grow and more people become part of that team? And like, how would you go about kind of cultivating that if you think it's a good idea?
I think it's probably a little bit more rare that I've
Yeah.
seen that happen, but I think that's almost, ultimately, and I have actually seen that happen. And it's in some ways a determinant of something that was very successful, right? Where I think in the circumstances in which I've seen that happen, it was a realization that the potential was much larger. So now
Mm,
we have served the needs of innovation that our enterprise needed, but we just found something here that's bigger than itself,
right.
and that there's now a bigger market potential for it. So how can we then go and scale this out?
Is there anything that I haven't asked you that either you'd like to share or that you think would add a really nice cap to our conversation?
I think we covered quite a bit of ground.
Yeah, we've covered a bit of ground here.
One thing maybe that I was just, I think reading recently is this idea of systems thinking, and in how I think we've talked when we look at innovation, there's things that there's you think about, breakthroughs and completely disrupting, the disruption of a model, right? Then we think about, okay, maybe there's the design thinking type of approach, which is, okay, let's think about the customer and journey of the customer, and how do we
Hmm.
develop products in that direction. And in the world that I live today, very focused on innovation driven by artificial intelligence, we're starting to go back to this necessity of systems thinking, which is, how do we think about impact? So we have technology, we have we have power we've never had before with the understanding of natural language and with reasoning capabilities in the solutions
Hmm.
that we build. But that could also, if used in a way that's maybe not responsible, it could drive certain outcomes that are not the outcomes that we would have desired. So that forces us to, as we're thinking about innovation, it forces us to almost imagine multiple steps further
Hmm.
and say, how can we actually, the steps that we take today and the breakthroughs and the disruption that we want to create, or the enablement that we want to create, how can we maybe, shift them slightly to the right or slightly to the left, so that in the systems that they are going to interact with, the impact is the one that we actually want to drive versus one
Yes.
that's highly undesirable. So I think it's another lens to maybe that idea that it's not completely chaotic, that there's a lot of thinking behind it, but this idea of the systems impact and systems thinking, especially as it relates to, artificial intelligence driven innovation.
Gotcha. Awesome. Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective and one that I hadn't really spent much time thinking about, but I certainly will now. Awesome. Well, Celia, thank you so much for your time. If folks want to learn from you, reach out to you, what's the best place to follow you to see what you're thinking about or what you're sharing these days?
LinkedIn would be the best place, and yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone who wants to connect. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's how we got connected. So it works, folks. Awesome. Celia, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your being here and look forward to following you on LinkedIn and seeing what else you're working on.
Fantastic. Thanks, Danny.
That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in to Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast. Join us again for our next episode, and don't forget to subscribe at innovatedisruptordie.com. That's all, folks.